Hi, everybody. This is my first presentation about presidential elections in U.S. history. The first one, 1789, that we'll be discussing today, is one of several sort of unique kinds of presidential elections. And these are really interesting to me, and I hope that all of you who watch this will find it interesting too. Um, Several unusual things about the first presidential election is one of three that were essentially elections with only one candidate for president. It was also one of only three that was held in a year that was not a leap year, the other two being 1800 and 1900. But all other presidential elections were held in leap years. Some of the sort of quirky things about 1789 was that the because it was the first one, it set several precedents that I'd like to sort of introduce you to. And some of these items that happen in other presidential elections become kind of standard and expected. So I won't necessarily go over all of these things in later episodes. So I hope you enjoy this. And if you do find it informative or helpful, um, feel free to give me a like. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to change the. Okay. One thing I'd like to start with is these are the people who were elected: George Washington and John Adams. I was thinking that in follow-up live streams, that the main slide here will show the primary people who are running for president. John Adams was running for vice president, not running for president, but I have him here just to have two. And in the early presidential elections, the flag would often change from election to election. So this is the 13-star flag that was being used in 1789. So let's get into the story. One thing that we often forget about is that the United States had a Congress before the election of 1789. And this Congress met under the auspices of the Articles of Confederation. Sometimes people call it the Continental Congress. A better term is the Confederation Congress. They met in New York City from 1785 until 1788. So during the time that the Constitution was being drafted, and then during the presidential election of 1789, Congress was sort of meeting, because one of the continuing problems with the Confederation Congress is that a lot of delegates wouldn't show up. And it's somewhat of an irony, because the states paid them to attend Congress, and sometimes they would take the money but not show up. And during the Constitutional Convention, several of the people who attended the convention, which was held in Philadelphia, were also members of Congress, which at that time met in New York City, as you can tell by the dates here, which took a bunch of people away from Congress. Anyway, it was a continuing problem that they often didn't have a quorum. But in 1788, Congress had three main issues. The second one involved two geographic areas, so I split them up here. The first thing that Congress did in 1788 was to pass a budget for 1789, which became very convenient once Congress was reorganized under the U.S. Constitution, because they actually had money to do things. The second thing the last Confederation Congress did was they held hearings and approved policies for managing the Northwest Territory, which is something that we often don't think about that being a big thing that Congress does, but it was a big thing that the Confederation Congress did. One of the final issues about the Confederation Congress was a problem about accepting new lands or new states. The people who lived in the far western parts of Virginia, an area that was then called the District of Kentucky, wanted to become a separate state, and Virginia, the legislature in Virginia approved that. And so they applied to the Confederation Congress to become a state. The problem was that the Articles of Confederation had no provisions for adding new states. So they didn't feel like they could do anything about it. And as time progressed, they realized that since the Constitution was about to take effect anyway, they would just kick the can down the road and let the new Congress deal with it. A similar situation happened with the western parts of Georgia, which are today Alabama and Mississippi. Georgia wanted to give that land to Congress. And the reason the states did that, like when Virginia gave up the Northwest Territory, was that gave Congress land that it could sell to settlers so that it would have an income. That was the primary purpose of states doing that. For whatever reason, though, they rejected that. The primary thing that the last Confederation Congress is known for, though, is their discussion of how to set up the new government. This is a map that shows the original 13 states and the dates of the early ratifications. I have the states weighted here by the original electoral vote. And one of the reasons for that will become clear in just a minute. New Hampshire ratified the Constitution on June 21, 1788. And when it did that, it became the 9th state to ratify. And so therefore the Constitution was in effect. So at that point, the states that are colored in blue here had ratified. So these constituted the United States then. And you'll see in history sometimes people will comment about the fact that Virginia and New York had not ratified yet. And they say that was troublesome for people who were going through this because those were the two biggest states. And how could we have a new country with the two biggest states not joining? Okay, well, if you look at this, one thing you'll notice is New York is about the same size as New Jersey and Connecticut, because the people who drafted the Constitution didn't know how big the states really were. And when they assigned the U.S. representatives to the various states, they felt that New York was about the same size as Connecticut and New Jersey. To them, Virginia was the biggest state in terms of population, and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were tied for second. So for people at the Confederation Congress, they may have had some issues about, well, how can we do this given the fact that we meet in New York State and it's not ratified yet? But soon thereafter, both Virginia and New York ratified the Constitution and joined the Union. But North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't do it before the first presidential election. When James Madison and Hugh Williamson and the other people who are members of the Confederation Congress returned after the Constitutional Convention, they brought a letter with the text of the Constitution, which directed the Confederation Congress to set up the first rounds of elections. So they discussed, well, how do we do that? How do we organize that? What's the process? And it took them 2 months to figure this out. One of the big hangups that they actually had was, where are they going to direct the the new U.S. government to meet. And as they continued to wrangle about that and not be able to make a decision, one of the delegates pointed out that it really wasn't important where they decided that the first federal government would meet, because the new government would probably change its mind anyway and move somewhere else. So on September 13, 1788, Congress took a vote on the bill that was before them at that point as it stood. And the vote for that, 9 states voted yes in favor of it. 4 states weren't able to vote because they either had only one delegate there or they didn't have any. And at that, under the Articles of Confederation, a state had to have 2 delegates present in order to vote, which is one of the reasons why absences were such a problem. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about that is that when the vote was taken, every delegate to the Confederation Congress voted in favor of it. So it was unanimous from the perspective of the people who were actually on the floor that day. One thing that happened as a result of this, though, the very next day, a quarter of the members of the Confederation Congress left and went home. And the number of members went down pretty quickly, so that by a month after that, as you see, they no longer had a quorum. And November the 1st was the end of the year for the Confederation Congress. On the 3rd, some new members arrived to take office, and some departing members checked in just to see, is there anything that we need to do before we go home? But there weren't enough people to have a quorum after that. Then on March the 2nd of 1789, Charles Thomson, who was the secretary of the Continental and then the Confederation Congress, called people together to sort of wrap up everything. Only one delegate even showed up, so he wrote a minute that closed the Confederation Congress. The point of all this is, once the delegates realized that the new government under the Constitution was ready to be elected, things really fell apart quickly for the Confederation Congress. This is the schedule that they came up with. One of the weird things about the Confederation Congress is when they passed something, they called that an ordinance, like the Northwest Ordinance. So this was the Federal Election Ordinance. They set up this schedule. The presidential electors would be chosen on January the 7th, 1789. However, states wanted to do it. Then a month later, the people elected as presidential electors would gather in their states to cast their electoral vote. And 1 month after that, the new Congress would meet to count the electoral votes to see who had won and would become president and who would become vice president. Now, the states, for the most part, had problems figuring out, should we let the people vote or should we let the state legislatures choose presidential electors? This is something I don't think has been explained well in the past. So I created this map to show an interesting dynamic, which is only the states in New England and New York elected the governors by the popular vote. All the other states, from New Jersey and Pennsylvania south to Georgia, elected their governors by their legislature. So it's an interesting question. If they thought that people weren't informed enough to elect their governor, how could they be informed enough to elect the president when they're so much further removed from an ability to really know who these people are, the candidates? And they've been judged for that, for saying, well, we need to let the state legislatures make these decisions. I think kind of wrongly. Newspapers really weren't a big thing back then. Some newspapers existed, but there weren't very many newspapers in the United States at that point. So the fact that multiple states allowed the people to choose the presidential electors is kind of remarkable, given that several of these states were not allowing voters to elect their own governor. While these discussions were taking place, the Confederation Congress being in New York State, a lot of the people who were delegates were kind of upset, like, what's wrong with what we're doing right now? Why do we need to replace this? And they would chat among themselves sometimes, and sort of gossip would get around. The governor of New York was George Clinton, and he was very much opposed to the Constitution. So some of these people who were discussing, well, okay, what are our options, the people who oppose the Constitution? Because everybody had a good sense that George Washington would be the candidate of the Federalist Party who supported the new Constitution. So the Anti-Federalists had the options of, we could just stand aside, let the Federalists do their thing and do whatever we want to in opposition to that. Or we could participate in the new government and try to get some changes made to the Constitution. Because several of the states had proposed amendments that became eventually the Bill of Rights. So these people meeting in New York discussed what their options were. And some of the people from New York and the people from Virginia who were anti-federalist were looking at this map of how many electoral votes every state has. And they were saying, okay, if we could get New York and Virginia as a whole, and Massachusetts was really close when they voted whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So if we could get half of Massachusetts, that would give us 25 electoral votes. So if we let the Federalists have the rest of New England, they would have 17. 39 would be left. And in this calculation, I'm not including North Carolina and Rhode Island. So they felt like they had a pretty good chance, actually, of winning this first election. So then they looked at, well, who could we run? And one of the people that they actually liked was Patrick Henry. And a problem came up here because everybody knew that George Washington was going to be the winner of the first presidential election. So if the Anti-Federalists nominated or supported George Washington, which they did, and Patrick Henry, the presidential electors from Virginia wouldn't be able to vote for both of them, because in the early presidential elections, each presidential elector cast 2 electoral votes, and the person who placed first became president, the person who placed second became vice president, but they could not vote for 2 people from the same state. So Patrick Henry was not an option. Interestingly enough, after the federal government was initiated, he actually switched sides and became a Federalist. So the Anti-Federalists decided, we're going to support George Washington for president and George Clinton, the governor of New York, for vice president. And the Federalists heard about this and were very disturbed. James Madison, in particular, made some statements that the Anti-Federalists were going to cause the new government to commit suicide. And the Federalists need to get their act in order and win this. So Alexander Hamilton traveled to Mount Vernon and met with George Washington. to convince him to run, because George Washington did not want to run. He was very happy being back at Mount Vernon after returning from the Constitutional Convention. And he made it clear to Alexander Hamilton if somebody else wanted it, he was not even going to be a candidate. But Alexander Hamilton tried to make the case that nobody would run against George Washington for president, for good reason. One of the things about the Constitutional Convention is that George Washington, as he presided, allowed everybody else to make the decisions. And he was just up at the table, like to recognize the next person to speak and to count the votes and things like that. But he didn't try to influence, for the most part, what the delegates were doing. He allowed them to carry out their responsibilities. And everybody liked that he was not trying to guide the delegates to some specific outcome. So the question is, who becomes the candidate for vice president? Several people were interested in it. One of them was John Hancock, who famously signed the Declaration of Independence. The issue with John Hancock was that he was rather sick in 1788, and he was serving at that point as governor of Massachusetts, and he was actually running for re-election. And he wasn't able to really carry out his duties as governor. So why would he be elected vice president if he already has a job he's not able to do? Several other people were considered for this by the Federalists. Samuel Adams was one. People started to coalesce around John Adams, who had the nickname the linchpin of the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton was not really sure that he had the right temperament to be president, which is kind of funny because Alexander Hamilton did not have a good temperament to be president himself. And Hamilton tried to get the Federalists to go with Henry Knox, which they didn't do. So, therefore, we have two nationwide tickets in 1789. Both of them support George Washington for president. The Federalists primarily support John Adams for vice president, and the Anti-Federalists primarily support George Clinton. So this is one of those weird things where somebody running for president has two different people running for vice president, which appeared in American history from time to time. Okay, so while the parties were figuring this out, the states were trying to figure out, well, how do people vote? This is something we don't often think about. Because one might think that people would just show up and vote for president. But the states actually had to pass legislation to create the framework for the first presidential election. When Congress sent their message to the states saying it's time for you to do this, Pennsylvania's legislature was the only one in session, and it passed a law that provided for the voters to just go out and elect presidential electors statewide. And if you saw my earlier video, this is what was called the general ticket at that time. Now, as the legislature was trying to figure this out, how are we going to elect presidential electors? How are we going to elect members of the first Congress? Some of the Federalists got together to come up with a list of people running for presidential elector, because when people showed up to vote, they weren't voting for George Washington. They were voting for the presidential electors. So the Federalists wanted people to be able to come in with a list that they could put in the ballot boxes and not have to just come up with random names of people, because they were trying to win, right? And Maryland did the same thing. So those two states are colored blue here. They allowed for a statewide popular vote for presidential electors. Now, 4 states passed legislation to allow for the appointment of presidential electors. Ironically, this is the term that's used in the Constitution, that presidential electors are appointed. Most of the time, they've actually been elected. Connecticut, South Carolina, and Georgia provided that their state legislatures would meet and elect the presidential electors. South Carolina had a little quirk in their law there. They said that on the assigned day, whichever members of the General Assembly wanted to could show up in Charleston, and they would pick people. And when that day actually showed up, less than a third of the legislature even bothered to come. New Jersey is a little bit different because the legislature just said, we're not coming back together in the middle of the winter to do this. We'll just let the governor pick people. As far as I know, that's the only time that happened, that the governor of a state chose the presidential electors. Now, 2 states, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, required people to have a majority of the vote in order to take office. So in order to accommodate that, those 2 states provided that the voters would go to the polls a month before the presidential election to nominate presidential electors. And if there were vacancies, because if somebody did get a majority, then they were elected, and the legislature in New Hampshire or the general court in Massachusetts would gather on that day that had been assigned by Congress to fill all the vacancies. The states that are left over are Delaware and Virginia. And what they did was they carved up the state into districts. So when people went to the polls, they would vote for one person for presidential elector. Now, this was easy in Delaware because Delaware had 3 counties and 3 electoral votes. So every county elected one presidential elector. Virginia carved up the state into electoral districts. And it also carved up the state into congressional districts, which were not the same. Because today, when we think of district votes, we think about Maine and Nebraska, where whoever wins the congressional district gets that electoral vote, and whoever wins statewide gets 2 other electoral votes. That was used frequently in American history, but not in the first presidential election. Now, the first 2 states, New Hampshire and Massachusetts, nominated by popular vote their presidential electors in December of 1788. Then the first national election day was January the 7th, 1789. It was a very cold day. George Washington, for some reason, recorded how cold it was that day. And it was 32 degrees when he woke up. And the temperature, the high of the day was 39. So it was really cold in Virginia. So it was obviously freezing in other parts of the country, further north. So voters went to the polls in 4 states. The 2 states elected by districts, Delaware and Virginia, and the 2 states elected statewide, which are Pennsylvania and Maryland. And legislators met in 3 states and the governor in New Jersey to name their presidential electors. So on the right here are the one account of the popular votes. The popular votes for the election of 1789 weren't tabulated until late in the 20th century. It's kind of interesting that nobody cared for a long, long time how many people voted in 1789. So in the states where the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were running against each other, the Federalists won an overwhelming victory, about a 5-1 margin. In Pennsylvania, for example, the Anti-Federalists got about 20% of the vote. They were just really crushed. Half of that vote came from one county, which was Chester County, but they lost every county in Virginia. Then, aside from these sort of competitive type races, in the states where there was not competition between the two parties, 21,000 people voted for presidential electors. And those are often added to the Federalist numbers. I like to break them out because the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist indicate when the voters went to the polls, they had people running against each other to choose from. The 21,000 was something very different. In most of those cases, it was a real free-for-all where multiple people were all running against each other to cast this electoral vote, and all of them were going to vote for George Washington. But they were sort of the same party. But this adds up, if you accept these numbers, to 50,800 votes. Now, the presidential electors who were chosen by the people, including New Hampshire and Massachusetts, where they had that dual system, accounted for 42 electoral votes, and then 27 more were appointed. Aside from them, because that's the 69 that George Washington eventually received, in one district in Virginia, it was a district with 4 counties, and in Virginia's system, like in most states at the time that elected by districts, the sheriff of each county would meet together and they would tabulate who won in that district. So in one district in Virginia, which is the one I'm talking about now, 2 of the 4 sheriffs appeared on the appointed day, and they added up how many votes were cast for candidates for presidential elector, but the other 2 sheriffs never came. And the 2 sheriffs who were there weren't sure, well, what do we do? And they eventually just decided, we're just going to send in what we have. And the governor just looked at that and said, they didn't certify anybody, so I'm not going to declare anybody elected to cast that electoral vote. So one electoral vote got lost that way. Okay, one thing I should mention back here is that the Anti-Federalists, even though they really got crushed, they actually carried 3 districts in Virginia. And in one of these districts, they elected Patrick Henry, who was going to vote for George Washington, but then for George Clinton for his second vote, essentially a vice presidential vote. So of these 42 electoral votes, there were 39 Federalists and 3 Anti-Federalists. Now, Alexander Hamilton was worried about what happened, because if all the Federalist electors voted for Washington and Adams, and the Anti-Federalists decided, why don't we do something to undermine the Constitution? We'll vote for Clinton and Adams, not Clinton and Washington. Then John Adams would end up with more electoral votes than George Washington, and Adams would become president and Washington vice president. And Washington made it clear he really didn't want to do that. One thing that's kind of funny is that Alexander Hamilton was writing to people about this issue, and he called this the defect in the Constitution. This was a change in position for him because in the Federalist Papers, he wrote that this was the one thing about the Constitution that everybody liked, was the electoral vote. So he wrote to various people that he knew. James Wilson in Pennsylvania was one. And he sent people to go visit with the presidential electors in other states to try to get them to throw away an electoral vote or 2, just to make sure that George Washington placed first. One thing I should have mentioned earlier was that New York was not able to pass legislation to participate in the presidential election of 1789. So everybody knew that George Clinton did not have a chance of being elected. That really undermined his whole campaign not to have New York's electoral votes. So this guy, Samuel Webb, that was sent to Connecticut, arrived there on the day the presidential electors met and convinced them to do what Hamilton wanted. So here is a map that shows how the states voted in 1789. George Washington got 69, and there were 4 blank votes. One is the district in Virginia where nobody was certified to cast the electoral vote. And then 1 presidential elector in Virginia and 2 in Maryland didn't make it in time to cast their electoral votes, which created an issue that nobody had thought about. What happens if a presidential elector does not show up? And after this, the states amended their regulations for national elections to allow the presidential electors who did show up to fill any vacancies that day. So when the presidential electors met in their states, they organized, they elected a chairman to preside over their gathering, and they cast the electoral vote, and then they wrote a little document that explained who they voted for. And they mailed that to Charles Thompson, the Secretary of the Confederation Congress in New York City. And he held those documents to wait for the new Congress, members of Congress, to appear. Now, one thing, I don't know why this hasn't been shown much. I'm going to show you a very interesting map. This is the vote for vice president. And I'm not really sure why this does not appear in books about presidential elections. This shows in sort of the gray color that states the elector votes cast for John Adams. Mostly New England. He got half of Virginia, most of Pennsylvania. So he got 34, which is slightly less than half. John Jay here is represented. John Jay is the person in the upper left there. He received 9 electoral votes, mostly from New Jersey and Delaware. Robert Harrison got the electoral votes from Maryland. John Rutledge, and Harrison is the guy in the middle here on the left. John Rutledge is the guy on the lower left. He got most of the electoral votes from South Carolina, his home state. George Clinton got his 3 from Virginia, and that was it. And 11 voted for other people. This represents what people in the Constitutional Convention thought would happen every time in presidential elections. Just a scattering of a bunch of names, some of them prominent, some not prominent. And they expected Congress to meet and look at these and pick, usually from the top 2 or 3, who would be president, and whoever was in the lead other than that person would become vice president. As I said, the Confederation Congress last met on March the 2nd when 1 person showed up. And the U.S. Congress was scheduled to meet 2 days later on March 4. But not enough people were there. There was not a quorum either of the House or the new Senate. On April the 1st, the House had a quorum and they elected Frederick Muhlenberg to be the first speaker. The Senate finally had a quorum on the 6th, and they elected John Langdon to be president pro tem. And as soon as they did that, the House came over and they read the returns of the president from the presidential electors of the states. And they declared George Washington to be elected president, John Adams to be elected vice president. Then they assigned Charles Thompson as his final duty as Secretary of the Continental Congress to go notify George Washington. This is something a lot of people have reported about. One thing that's not been reported about, and again, I'm not really sure why, is Congress assigned Sylvanus Bourne to go and notify John Adams that he had been elected vice president. So these two guys took off to do their jobs. Bourne arrived at John Adams's house on April 10. And one of the things that's been reported about this is John Adams had his bag packed. He was ready to go, but he was waiting to be notified, and he was just all angry that he didn't get very many votes. Or he thought he should have gotten more. That's actually misleading, because a Connecticut mill owner paid for some cloth to be sent to John Adams so that he could have new clothes made to wear when he went to Congress. And it was taking some time to do that. And after Bourne arrived at John Adams's house, it was actually several days before Adams was actually ready to leave to travel to New York City. And then once he was ready to leave, the people of Boston all got together and they wanted to give him a going away party. So he went up to Boston. He lived outside of Boston. So they did that. And then as he traveled to New York City, people kept stopping. They wanted to thank him and sort of congratulate him for being elected vice president. This is another thing that hasn't really been reported about. And the reason this is important is this sets the stage for something similar but bigger to happen to George Washington. So John Adams arrived in New York City on the 20th, and Congress was in session, and they said, oh, he's here. So they let him just go up and take the chair to preside over the Senate. He did not take an oath of office that day. That actually happened later. The vice presidential oath was passed on June the 1st by Congress, and Washington signed it. And Adams took it on June the 3rd. So it's one of those little quirky things that he was inaugurated after George Washington, even though he had already been serving for a while. All right, well, Charles Thompson is this guy in the upper right here. This is a portrait of him at the time. He arrived at Mount Vernon and notified George Washington that he had been elected, which is what this sketch here is trying to portray. And then after that, they traveled together to New York City. And all along the way, like with Adams, they had this, people would come to meet him and sort of have a little party. So he had a big gathering in Alexandria, Virginia, and then through Maryland and Delaware. And when he got to the border with Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania was there with a bunch of people, and it was just sort of a celebratory procession. This shows George Washington arriving in New York City. And one thing that's interesting about this is George Clinton was running for re-election as governor of New York at the time. And it was a really close race because he had been really popular, and twice he ran without opposition as governor. But as the 1780s progressed, people were more and more unhappy with him for issues related to what do we do with people in Vermont who want to become an independent state. And also the issue of having a new bank in New York City. A lot of people wanted a new bank, but he didn't trust banks. So a lot of people were opposed to him in the election of 1789. So, and one of the things that he did was he made a big deal about going there to greet George Washington, because Washington was sort of the leader of the Federalist Party, although he tried to be above parties and represent everybody. And George Clinton was kind of running against him in the election. So by meeting with George Washington, it made him look more like a leader, and he ended up winning his election. That election was taking place the day that Washington was inaugurated, which is one of those really weird things that people would go to vote, and while they were doing that, they could look up at Federal Hall if they happened to be in New York City to vote, and they could watch Washington be inaugurated. I have just a little bit of information here about Federal Hall. The building that's there now is not the building that George Washington was in. That was an older building that, interestingly enough, was renovated by Pierre L'Enfant for the use of the U.S. federal government under the Constitution, which only used it for a year before it moved away to Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So this is that building. They're trying to portray George Washington taking the oath here. This is another likeness of that event that day when George Washington took office. And what they're showing here, the guy in green is Samuel Otis, who was Secretary of the U.S. Senate, and he's holding the Bible there. And the guy in between him and George Washington is this guy, Robert Livingston, you see in the upper left. He was the Chief Justice of New York State, who actually was an anti-federalist. So he was against all this stuff, but he read the oath to George Washington. And after they finished it, he turned to the crowd and he said, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States," which is similar to what people said in England sometimes, "Long live the king." But he said, "Long live President of the United States." One thing about the presidential oath is the text in the Constitution does not have the words, "So help me God," at the end. And most presidents have said, "So help me God." The newspapers in 1789 carried an account of what happened that day, a really detailed account. None of them mentioned that George Washington said that. In most of the colonies, that was a regular part of oaths, so that was something people would be likely to say. He would be likely to add that, particularly because he was kind of worried about his overall reputation in history, like, what if this fails? And okay, so we don't know if he said it. The earliest statement that he did say it is from like 1820s, long time after that. So maybe he did say it. It seems that he didn't. It's really not a big deal. The last president who didn't say, "So help me God," interestingly, because it was voluntary for a long time. And sometimes people would say it, and sometimes they wouldn't. The last one who didn't say it was Herbert Hoover. Okay, so then after that, they all went inside, and George Washington he gave his inaugural address, which was short. And so here we see him standing up on the little platform there, and you can see Robert Livingston there. This address is very unlike later inaugural addresses, except Washington did this again in 1793. It was just a short thing that, I've been elected and I'm here and I want to work with you to make this a success. Interestingly enough, while he was doing it, he had planned to make a hand gesture. I mean, it was a really short address. It's only just a few minutes long. But anyway, this hand gesture came off really awkwardly, and the senators kind of needled him about that afterwards. Okay, so George Washington was elected the first president. John Adams was elected the first vice president. And the federal government under the Constitution was up and going. So next time we'll look at sort of what happened in their first term in office and how they got reelected. Washington unanimously, Adams not unanimously in 1792. So thank you much for your time watching this. I hope you found this informative and interesting. And if you like this, feel free to subscribe. I'm going to try to do once a week to do the next presidential election. So we'll kind of work forward in time, probably until around like the election of 2000. Okay, thanks so much. Have a great day.